Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the New Living Expo. How are you?
Well, thank you.
Hey, it's good to see you. I'm Robert Perella, and I'm a big fan of Dan Sheehan, and I've been around his institute for a while. Thank you for coming out today, because I think we come out for really a calling in our spirit, that something is intrinsic to our experience. There are fantastic happenings that are happening in whether it's international and domestic policy, whether it's world events, whether it's your spirituality. Something brought you here. You know, it is said that leadership is founded upon people who make intelligent decisions that benefit the masses, with often startling and incredible results. And nothing more can be said for our speaker today. He is the world-renowned lawyer who's handled cases like the Karen Silkwood case. Remember that, with the nuclear accident, who was awarded $10 million. He handled the Pentagon Papers. He handled even the Watergate break-in. And he handles current cases today for both you and many people around the country, and certainly the Lakota people that are being displaced in South Dakota, etc. More than anything else, he's a teacher, and he's going to be doing a conference next weekend at the Cabrillo College in Santa Cruz, and that'll be on human rights, and he is a human rights champion. He is fighting for the people, fighting for us. Brace for impact. This is Daniel Sheehan.
Thank you, Robert. Anyway, I want to get right to it. We have lots of different things that you want to be attending today. So I want to. There are going to be three different but closely related issues that I want to be talking about with you over the next hour or so. The first one is going to be the upcoming global climate change that we hear so much about and that we're beginning to see the manifestations of all around us right now. The second issue is going to be the rising of a major national security state here in the United States, with the passage of the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act and others that we'll touch upon this afternoon. And the third one, and a little bit more surprising, is the upcoming papal encyclical that is going to be being issued by Pope Francis, the new pope, now that they've bounced out old Ratzinger. That he's going to be issuing a major papal encyclical on the issue of global climate change in transnational corporate capitalism. And so I want to talk about the three of these things here today. So I want to start out first dealing with the issue of major global climate change. As you may remember, in November, on November 1st of 2014, just at the end of last year, the International Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations issued its fifth major report on global climate change. And they were stating very specifically that they're anticipating the rise of potentially from 7 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit in the mean global temperature in the United States and the rest of the world by 2100. The authors are talking about the fact that there is going to be major increased violence being projected, because with the rising of from 7 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, they're anticipating a potential rise of 3 feet, 36 inches potentially, in the global mean sea level. Now, this is all going to be being generated by the melting of the ice caps that we've all heard about now. We see periodically on the evening news pictures now of boats going all the way up to the North Pole with no ice there anymore. The polar bears floating on little ice packs with gigantic sections of the glacial fields dropping off the size of Rhode Island and floating out to sea. This type of activity is being caused by the increasing global heat in the planet that is being retained on our planet because of the emission of global greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere that act as a trapping agent for the heat from our planet. When the sun shines on the planet, and rather than being able to escape from the planet, it bounces off this layer of global greenhouse gas emissions and it is reflected back onto the planet, causing major disruption, increased ocean temperatures, which in turn give rise to major hurricanes and tornadoes of sizes that we've never seen in recorded history, and that you can see these happening over and over and over again. And that one of the major dangers that isn't focused upon so much is that the melting of the polar ice caps and putting all of that fresh water into the ocean is reducing the salination level of the oceans, and therefore the density of the oceans, threatening to cause the underwater currents to rise to the surface and dissipate. And these underwater currents, these warm water underwater currents, are what in fact generate the temperate zone on our planet. This between basically 24 degrees north and south of the equator to 60 degrees north and south of the equator. This is where some 80% of all the food in the world is grown. And it's generated because of the movement of these underwater currents. And that if in fact those underwater currents are dissipated because of the lowering of the density of the oceans, this could in fact destroy the entire ability of the area where 75 to 80% of all the food on the planet is grown. Moreover, it turns out that 2/3 of all of the potable water on the planet is contained in the polar ice fields, in glaciers. This is in the gradual melting of those is what feeds most of the rivers of the world that flow down from the ice caps. That with the dissolution of those ice caps and the reduction of that water, we will lose potentially 2/3 of all of the potable water on our planet, by the year 2100. And the remaining 1/3 of the potable water is in the underground aquifers. And about 20% of those are all within 10 miles of the sea coasts. So with the expansion of the seas, because of the increased temperature, not because of the water going in from the ice caps, but from the expanded heat of the oceans, that the flooding and the increased tidal waves and stuff is going to be inundating potentially up to 10 miles of the sea coasts around the entire planet. And by the year 2050, they anticipate over 51% of all of our human population to be living within 20 miles of the sea coasts around the world. So what this is going to generate is a massive necessary migration from the sea coasts inland of all these, plus the major cities that exist all along the sea coast that were built because of the access to the harbors out throughout our human history. The massive migration of these people is going to be causing all kinds of major confrontations between the people escaping from the sea coast, moving inland into other people's territory. And so there's all kinds of anticipation of very serious social disruption occurring because of this. There is, in fact, a major year-long course that is being taught at Harvard University now called Environmental Studies 130. And it's the social and diplomatic impact in world environmental crisis coming because of global climate change. So this is being taught at Harvard University now to all of the potential future government leaders, etc., to start preparing for this type of a crisis. And in the face of this rising threat, what we see, for example, is that immediately after the issuance of the International Panel on Climate Control's fifth study, that what we saw was that the Republican Party in the House of Representatives actually introduced a bill to House Resolution 662 to block all future U.S. contributions to the United Nations to finance any future reports by the International Panel on Climate Change. And they also introduced House Resolution 910, which was to prohibit the Environmental Protection Agency from classifying the emission of global greenhouse gases as a pollution. These are the types of activities and responses that we're getting from the reactionary wing of the Republican Party, which, as you know, now controls both houses of our national legislature. The principal author of the International Panel on Climate Change's report, Professor Michael Oppenheimer, says that we are all sitting here now like sitting ducks, waiting for the consequences of this. He said the last time that the CO2 levels hit 400 parts per million, it caused the Arctic to be 14 degrees warmer than it was in 1990. And we are now headed for 550 particles per million. And they anticipate by the year 2100, they will be at approximately 936 parts per million. And so that they're anticipating, without some type of radical intervention, that the continued conversations that keep going on at these conferences that come up every few years in Rio and in Japan and different places, what we keep encountering is that the International Panel on Climate Change keeps insisting that we have to reduce by 70% the average annual emission of global greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to avoid this type of catastrophe. And yet, the administration proposes a 17% reduction. And the Republican majority in the House and Senate is demanding nothing more than a 7% reduction in the global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So this is the situation that we're basically confronted by, because if we lose 2/3 of all the potable water on the planet that is available for agricultural irrigation and for drinking water for the human family, and the remaining third that is along the coast, 20% of it, we're going to lose another 1/5 of the even remaining 1/3 of the potable water that we have. So that what they're looking toward is potential water wars. And you can see major corporations now moving to attempt to purchase areas in land that have access to the potable water now, so that they can control the potable water and to sell it in bottles for us. So this is the potential catastrophe that we are actually confronting here within the next 100-year period, and the major problem is not being adequately addressed by any of the legislatures, because in addition to this, the alteration in the salination levels of the sea will actually kill off the plankton that are in the sea, which is at the root of the food chain in the entire ocean. Therefore, the larger fish in the larger sea life will start to die because of a lack of any sustaining of the major food chain. So what we're asking now is what type of intervention is going to be necessary in order to stop this major catastrophe from befalling all of us within the next 100 years. And as I pointed out, there are people that are aware of this, such as at Harvard University and the United States Defense Department, and the military and others are starting to prepare for the potential type of disruption that is going to be predicted, rather than directing their attention to stopping the continued emissions of pollutants in the atmosphere. What they're doing is they're actually moving to attempt to quell any type of civil disturbances that arise. Now, one of the other things that people haven't thought about, but the fact of the matter is that there are some 400 private nuclear power plants that are all located immediately upon the seashores around the world now, such as Fukushima. That the problem is that with the rising sea levels, and you know that we had Diablo Canyon and San Onofre right here in California that are right on the seacoast, because they use the seawater to pump through the reactors to cool the reactors. And so that's been done. 400 of these are all over the world. And if in fact those reactors come underwater as a result of major tidal influxes, we're going to have massive contamination, radioactive contamination of the seawater. So that, one could go on and on about what the list of major potential catastrophes are here. But I want to shift to the second item that I've raised, which is the rising of a national security state in the stead of making efforts to restrict the global greenhouse gas emissions. The national security state is moving into place to attempt to address the potential civil disturbances that they're anticipating in response to this. And we have seen since 9/11, we have seen a massive increase in the internal structures of a national security state here in the United States, with the passage of the Patriot Act, with the authorization for the use of force given to the President, and the National Defense Authorization Act. What I want to do is I want to quickly cover here, in the time that we have, some information that you probably don't know about, and that is this, is that some 6 months prior to the announcement by the Soviet Union, there was on December 31st of 1991, that the Soviet Union was going to be voluntarily dissolving itself. That 6 months prior to that time, when the Central Intelligence Agency started reporting to then President George H.W. Bush that there was some real possibility that the Soviet Union was going to be dissolving, the response on the part of the George Bush Sr. administration was to respond immediately by having George Bush Sr. send a private handwritten memo to Saddam Hussein in Iraq via April Gillespie, who was our United States ambassador from the United States to Iraq, that George H.W. Bush drafted this handwritten note in which he communicated to Saddam Hussein saying, look, I know that you've been having troubles with Kuwait on your southern border, and you believe that they may be engaged in slant drilling under your boundaries and taking your oil from Iraq. And if in fact you find it necessary to resort to the use of military force against Kuwait, I would like to let you know personally that I would not view that as adverse to the long-term interests of the United States. And so what happened is, not surprisingly, Saddam Hussein started mobilizing military forces along their southern border, on the northern border of Kuwait. And what happened is immediately the Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr., who was Dick Cheney, contacts Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador of the United States from Saudi Arabia, and invites him to come to the West Wing of the White House, and he announces to Prince Bandar in a meeting along with David Addington and Scooter Libby and Douglas Feith, announced to Prince Bandar that the United States had come into possession of information, very sensitive national security information, indicating that Saddam Hussein was planning to invade Kuwait. And he actually showed Prince Bandar real-time NSA videos of the assembling of the military forces of Saddam along the border. And then he told Prince Bandar that we had equally reliable intelligence information indicating that after Saddam Hussein went in and occupied Kuwait, he was going to be going into Saudi Arabia and overthrowing the House of Saud and occupying Saudi Arabia. And that he said that if this does come to pass, if, as we have told you, the invasion into Kuwait takes place and it's confirming the accuracy of our information, I would like you to invite me, the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to go to Saudi Arabia and meet with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah, because I would like to then trigger a secret 1972 treaty that was established by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger with King Faisal back in 1972 in August, when Kissinger and Nixon were flying home on the SR-71, the Blackbird, flying home from the secret meetings in China that they had, opening up China, that they stopped off in Saudi Arabia, and Kissinger and Nixon met with King Faisal at that time, and then also into Iran and met with the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi. And what they did at that point is they renegotiated the then 60-year-old exclusive lease that had been set up after World War I, the exclusive lease that the countries that were created at the end of World War I by the 1922 commission that was set up, chaired by then Secretary of Colonial Affairs for the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, set up a commission, and they're the ones that created the artificial boundaries all throughout the Middle East. That created Lebanon, in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, etc. Those were tribal territories for thousands and thousands of years. But at the end of World War I, because the Turkish Empire had allied with the Germans in World War I and had lost the war, the Allies moved in and established a whole set of nation states there in the Middle East and hand-picked potentates to put in charge of each one of those areas. The Abdul Aziz in the house in Saudi Arabia, the Kuwaiti royal family in Kuwait, etc. And what they did is they signed a exclusive lease agreement with those potentates, giving exclusive rights to various Western countries to produce the oil in those areas, agreeing to give the private family of the potentates that they had set up in charge a private percentage of the profits that were generated. And so that what happened is there was the 60-year lease that was put in place. It was then in 1922, and so it was a 60-year lease that was going to run to 1982. But what happened is that Kissinger, being the far-thinking fellow that he was, he said, look at Richard Nixon, here we are in 1972, you were getting ready to be re-elected again in November of 1972. So here we are in August of 1972. We're going to go and have this big opening to China, but on the way back, let's stop and meet with Saudi Arabia and Iran and renew the 60-year exclusive lease agreement. So they did. They stopped in and they agreed to renew the 60-year exclusive lease agreement. But what they did is they agreed that they would allow the Saudis and the Iranians to increase the cost of the petroleum from 47 cents a gallon at the pump at that time to $1.47 a gallon at the pump. And they would allow the governments of Saudi Arabia and Iran to keep that other additional dollar, but they had to agree to do three things with this additional money. Number one, they had to agree to purchase major military equipment from the United States manufacturers, such as the AWACS airborne radar or across the horizon radar systems that they had in F-15 fighter planes, etc. Second thing they had to do was they had to agree to use an additional portion of that extra dollar a gallon at the pump to dig out 4 major harbors in their countries to be able to take U.S. warships and to build 4 major aircraft landing bases and military bases inside their country with that extra money. And thirdly, they had to agree that if in the event that either Russia or China made any type of a feint toward invading and occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields, that they would invite the United States to come into their country, to bring their warships, our warships, into their harbors and land our military forces at those bases and fend off the Russians or the Chinese from invading the oil fields. So that secret agreement was established in August of 1972, which nobody knew about at all. And there was no discussion about it. It had not been ratified, been brought to the United States Senate for ratification at all, but it was an agreement that they had made. And so what Dick Cheney was asking Prince Bandar to do was to get King Farouk now to invite him to come in if, in fact, Saddam Hussein went ahead and invaded and occupied Kuwait, to invite them in because he wanted to trigger that particular secret agreement, even though it wasn't either Russia or China that was doing anything, threatening to invade the oil fields, but to invoke it against Saddam Hussein. so that the United States could then come in and drive him out of that territory. So when in fact Saddam Hussein went ahead and invaded and occupied Kuwait, sure enough, Prince Bandar contacted Dick Cheney, invited him to come to Saudi Arabia. They held the meetings with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah, and Cheney, per his plan, invoked this treaty and asked King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah to invite the United States to come in with our warships and our planes and our troops to occupy those bases and drive Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq. Well, what happened is that the chief of security for the House of Saud, Turki bin Faisal, the son of the former King Faisal, that he in fact realized that these meetings were going on, and he asked King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah to refrain from agreeing to do that, let him present to them an alternative means of getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So he appeared the next morning at 10 o'clock in a meeting. He brought with him Khalil Mahfouz, who is the head of the Royal Saudi Family Bank, and Mohammed Baroum, who was the heir to the wealthiest family in Saudi Arabia that owned all of the concrete and steel mills that had been used to build these major facilities. And they came in and they said, look, we have an alternative way to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and protect ourselves. We'd like to have you listen to that. So they agreed to listen to it. So they turned and opened the door, and in walks Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, the best friend of Faisal since they were 4 years old together in Saudi Arabia. And he invites them in, and Osama bin Laden says, look, I've got 10,000 battle-hardened Mujahideen troops that have just got through kicking the crap out of the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, sitting up in the Khyber Pass, and they're perfectly prepared to drive Saddam Hussein back into Iraq and prevent him from doing anything more. So don't invite the infidels into our holy lands, because if you do, they'll stay. They'll think of some reason to stay, so don't invite them in. So what happened is, while King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah were considering that option, Cheney, who was still there at the palace, found out about this second meeting and asked to have an additional meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah. Went in and had the meeting and said, look, we've got a sweetener for our deal. Not only will we agree to protect you against Saddam Hussein coming in and invading and throwing out the House of Saud, we will agree to protect you against your own people. Because you know they hate your guts, the people in Saudi Arabia. All of your 500 princes whoring all around Europe and losing $1 million on a roll of dice in Monte Carlo, and all of their Mercedes-Benzes and Bentleys and everything. They all hate you. And so what we'll do is we'll agree to protect you against your own people. All these kind of radical fundamentalists like the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? And so King Faoud agreed to that deal and invited the United States to come in. So the United States spent another few weeks gathering the willing around the world, like New Zealand and Zambia and a couple others that joined with them in this big alliance. And they invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields. And they sent in 500,000 troops and not surprisingly drove Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq. But then came up with the great idea that they weren't going to oust Saddam Hussein from power. They were going to set up a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone which would require 250,000 U.S. military personnel fully permanently based in Saudi Arabia to man the no-fly zone and occupy the Middle Eastern oil fields, just exactly as Turki bin Faisal told them was going to happen, and just as Osama bin Laden said. And so Osama bin Laden took his 10,000 Mujahideen and he mounted the jihad against them to drive them out of there, and bombed the embassies, American embassies in Africa, attacked the USS Cole in Yemen, blew up the Marine Corps barracks. You know, that's how this thing all started. And it's important to understand that that was triggered intentionally by these people, by George H.W. Bush and by Dick Cheney and these others, because they were afraid that they were going to be losing their ultimate enemy. the Soviet Union, that they were going to lose this ultimate other by means of which they had justified $300 billion military expenditures every single year throughout the entire Cold War. And so then they set themselves up in that kind of a situation. And so that's what we've been faced with. And so what happened is when, in fact, the retaliation took place on the part of these people to try to drive the U.S. forces out, they didn't have the capacity to just confront the U.S. forces and take them on man to man. So what they did is they began to engage in the classical types of guerrilla warfare that is undertaken by revolutionaries throughout the world. And they began to bomb embassies and do other things like this, and in fact participated in attacking the trade towers, etc. The first time that we know, they went in and they blew up the things under the trade towers and smutted the place out. This is what began the war on terrorism. And when the events of 9/11 took place, what happened is immediately, it's important to remember that what happened. The question is, why did this thing happen in September of 2001? And the answer to that is because when George W. Bush ended up getting selected to be the President of the United States and came in, he was planning to invade Afghanistan. A full-scale plan to invade Afghanistan because they wanted to build a pipeline that went from the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, all the way down into the warm water ports. And the major contractor for that pipeline was in fact the Carlyle Group, which was created by George H.W. Bush and by James Baker and others. So this whole operation was, and so they were pressuring the Afghans to agree to this pipeline, and they wouldn't do it. They finally resolved that they weren't going to accept the pipeline there anymore. And so what the George W. Bush administration did is they immediately issued an ultimatum to them that if they didn't turn over Osama bin Laden to them, who they said was in charge of blowing up the embassies in Africa in the attack on the USS Cole, etc., if they didn't turn them over to them, they were going to invade them. And so they had a full-scale invasion perfectly planned, and that is what triggered the attacks of 9/11. Because the attacks that came down at 9/11 were an attempt to deter them from doing that. Now that's setting aside all of the discussions that I know you want to have about what happened in 9/11 and who was behind 9/11 and was it real or was it not. And that's for another day to discuss. But the bottom line is that when the attacks took place at 9/11, they immediately went to work, and they on September 18th, the W. Bush administration moved to have an authorization for the use of force that they got passed immediately on September 18th. They moved it on September 18th. It was put on the floor. It was approved on September 19th. It was signed on September 20th. So they had the authorization for the use of force. And then they moved in with the Patriot Act. They moved into the Patriot Act a telephone-sized bill that they had coincidentally fully prepared, and they presented it. On October 23rd, and in the House it was approved on October 24th. It moved to the Senate. It was approved on October 25th, and it was signed into law on October 26th by W. And they hadn't even read it. I mean, the vast number of the people in the House of Representatives and Senate all have admitted that they never even read the thing. And it set up this huge, massive surveillance system, wiretapping telephones, monitoring people's emails, monitoring your Google contacts, etc. And so that ultimately they ended up passing the National Defense Authorization Act. What the Republicans decided to do, or the Bush administration decided they were going to do, is they were going to bundle all of the military appropriations and all of the anti-terrorist funding into one bill. So they put it in front of the Congress, and if anybody tried to vote against it, they could attack them for being soft on terrorism. And so they put the entire bill together, and they would slip things into these bills. Like in 2006, they slipped in Section 1076, which was this rather extraordinary provision that authorized the United States military to go into any state in the United States and to supplant the authority of the state in the event that there was an act of terrorism, or there was this intriguing additional provision that they had, which it said this. It says that Section 1076 of Public Law 109-364 to authorize the deployment of U.S. military troops into the states to enforce state and local laws in the event of any act of terrorism, or the authority to send U.S. military troops into any state to enforce the local laws in the event of any incident or occasion in which the President determines that domestic violence has occurred in a way that may in fact incapacitate or restrict the maintaining of public order in the due course, or to suppress in any state any conspiracy or unlawful combination that is planning to obstruct the due course of the enforcement of law. Okay. In case anybody's not familiar with the Posse Comitatus Act, this sets aside almost 200 years of law in the United States prohibiting the deployment of U.S. military forces into the states to supplant local authority. Now, this was undertaken by W. Bush, drafted by David Addington, the private lawyer basically for Dick Cheney. And they've continued this, and they actually have passed, and this is what I want to close this second part of the talk on, they actually passed the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021 and 1022, which actually authorized the United States military to arrest an American citizen here in the United States without any probable cause to believe that he or she has committed any criminal act simply upon a finding by an executive department official that there is reason to suspect that that person may have provided substantial support to any organization or individual who harbors hostile intentions toward the United States or any of its allies, okay? And that they are to be taken into custody, military custody, detained in a military facility, and in fact denied the right to contact anybody to notify them that they've been taken into custody, and to have no right to have any attorney, have no right of habeas corpus. They're not allowed to be brought in front of any magistrate to make any determination of the existence of probable cause to believe that they've committed a crime. Why? Because that isn't a requirement. It isn't a requirement that they be found to be probably engaged in any criminal conduct. So they don't have any right to be arraigned in front of a magistrate. And if, in fact, they're going to be given any hearing at all, it will be in front of a military tribunal. And in front of the military tribunal, they will have no right to counsel. They'll have no right to confront the people who have accused them, because that would reveal the sources of information that the military had gotten against them. And in fact, they're not only not allowed to cross-examine the witnesses, they're not even allowed to know what the evidence is that's being presented against them. I'm telling you, this is true. I mean, you people have known me for a long time, for all the time, for doing the Karen Silkwood case, doing the Iran-Contra case, doing a 3 Mile Island litigation and all of that. I'm telling you that this is the state of law in the United States at this point in time. And so this particular set of instrumentalities are in the hands now of the United States military in the executive branch, so that they can, in fact, arrest any one of us at any time without any probable cause to believe that we've committed any crime whatsoever, merely upon the suspicion that we may have lent substantial assistance to any type of individual or association or organization that harbors hostile intentions toward the United States or any of our allies. And in fact, if you have any question about that, Chris Hedges, and Dan Ellsberg, and Naomi Wolf, and others brought a major federal litigation against this act in New York City, and set forth in affidavits that they intended to be able to interview people around our country and around the world that were critical of U.S. military policies, and that might even include some of the people that were associated and had hostile intentions toward us. And they said that they therefore had reasonable grounds to believe that they could be subjected to this particular National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021 and 1022, and they wanted an injunction. They wanted it declared unconstitutional in an injunction. And the judge, Catherine Forrest, an Obama-appointed judge,
confronted the U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. He said, look, we can deal with this case easily. You just can assure us here that those particular kind of activities that they were talking about engaging in, simply doing reporting, couldn't possibly be considered an act of substantial assistance to these people, and we'll dismiss the case. And the U.S. attorney said, no, I'm not prepared to say that that would not be covered. Okay? And so she declared it unconstitutional. The Obama administration appealed it and got it reversed by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And so that law still stands here in the country today. And so that I wanted to share that with you, especially in this context of this upcoming major potential catastrophic situation with global climate change and the refusal on the part of the administrations to do, Republican and Democrat, to do anything serious to stop this event from taking place, other than mounting up a major national security state apparatus, which is going to be designed to be able to quell these type of disturbances. So this brings us to the Papal encyclical, which is going to be issued this June by the new Pope, Pope Francis. You've all heard a lot of the interesting press about him, but one of the things you've probably heard is that he's the first Jesuit in history to ever be elected Pope. And you may know, in one of my previous incarnations, prior to the Silkwood case and all that, is I was chief counsel for the United States Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., in their social ministry office, and drafted major pieces of proposed legislation, banning nuclear weapons, supporting birth control, trying to get the major church facilities to change some of their positions on these things. And the fact of the matter is that the Jesuits, it's extremely important to understand, all the bad history that the Jesuits have, which is very real, just like the bad history that the United States has, which is very real. The bottom line is, in 1962, there was a new Jesuit Superior General that was selected. His name is Pedro Urrupe. I should tell you a quick story about him, and so you'll understand what has changed now with regard to the whole Society of Jesus, the largest major order inside the Catholic Church. That what happened is Pedro Urrupe was a medical doctor, a surgeon, that back in the 1920s in Spain, where he came from, he became a Jesuit priest, and he began to preach from the pulpits against Franco and the fascists, and condemning Hitler and the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. And because of that, Franco issued an assassination order against him. And one of the three guys that was on the team that was supposed to assassinate Urrupe went to confession and told the priest that he was terribly troubled that he was being ordered to kill this priest. And so the priest asked him who it was and found out that it was Pedro Urrupe, went to see his bishop. The bishop contacted the provincial in Spain, and the provincial of the Jesuits took Pedro Urrupe out of Spain and sent him to a Buddhist monastery in Japan, where he was protected. And it turns out that that monastery was in Hiroshima. And when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, it totally devastated this monastery. And when Pedro Urrupe regained consciousness in the devastated monastery, he saw the clock on the wall was stopped. And he said that he knew that we had come to the end of normal time, and that we had crossed over into the end time. He is the one who led the people out from under the mushroom cloud in Hiroshima up onto the mountains of where the monastery was and protected them and gave them medical assistance. Because of that, he in fact was chosen by Pope John the 23rd when he decided to have Vatican II to radically reform the Catholic Church and to bring it into the modern age. John the 23rd selected Pedro Urrupe to be the chair of the Committee on Ecumenical Relations with other religions because of his familiarity with Buddhism. So Urrupe was in Rome at the time the Superior General of the Jesuit order passed away. And so John the 23rd recommended Pedro Urrupe to be the new Superior General of the Jesuits. And now that's usually the kiss of death, because the 100 provincials of the Jesuits will not select a person recommended by the Pope, because then they'd have no independence. But what happened is when the 100 provincials came into Rome to pick their new superior general, the right-wing fascist Secretary of State for Pius XII, Cardinal Villot, went to the conclave and went around buttonholing each one of the provincials saying, you can't vote for this Pedro Arrupe. He's a communist. He opposed Franco. He was so they were saying, wait a second, on third thought, maybe we better give this guy another look. And so they all decided, they ended up choosing Pedro Arrupe to be the new superior general of the Jesuits. So all 100 provincials, many of whom hadn't met him, came over to the Jesu, the great big international headquarters for the Jesuits next to the Vatican, coming in, expecting to have, whiskey and drinks and a little social gathering to get to meet him. And they came into the Jesu, and there was no furniture there was no drinks, there was no ashtrays. All they had was 100 Zafu pillows. And Pedro Arrupe sitting there in a Zen meditation waiting for them. And so they all came in and they were all going, oh shit, do we get to vote again? Anyway, so they all ended up taking their shoes off and sitting on these little pillows. And Arrupe opened his eyes and he said, I have seen the end times. He said, and that we are going to have radical changes here in the Society of Jesus, because we have to take steps to deconstruct the structural sources of injustice here in Western civilization and in Eastern civilization. And that this obligation has to be equal to your preaching of the Mass every day. And he undertook radical changes in the Jesuit order. And they ended up passing a thing called the 32nd General Congregation Documents on Justice. And this is a radical set of documents that has been attacked by Ratzinger. That Ratzinger, who was Benedict, was the head of the Committee on Orthodoxy in the Catholic Church. He's the one that banned Hans Küng and Teilhard de Chardin and all of the others. And we have just gotten through kicking his ass out, as you saw. And people go, what was that all about? Anyway, he's out. And in comes Francis, who's the head of this organization now of radical priests, and nuns too, that began the liberation theology all through Latin America to organize the peasants against the fascists that are all down in South America and Central America. And this is who now is the Pope. And what he's done is he has, Tuesday morning after this weekend, there is going to be a major Vatican conference that is going to be gathered at the Vatican, chaired by Cardinal Peter Turkson, who is the head of the Council for Justice and Peace of the entire Catholic Church. And it's going to be keynoted by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the issue of global climate change. And Cardinal Turkson has done a major speech at the St. Patrick's Pontifical University at the beginning of Lent, just now before Easter, and he has laid out the major principles that are going to be discussed in this upcoming encyclical. The encyclical of the Pope is one of the most powerful documents inside the Catholic Church, setting down official doctrine for the Catholic Church. And he has Peter Turkson has. There's a long discussion that he has here that I want to read certain parts of it to you. He says, Pope Francis intends to publish an encyclical later this year on the themes of human ecology. He will explore the relationship between the care for creation and integral human development and concerns for the poor. That he's going to be doing this now in preparation for a major speech that the Pope is getting set to make at the United Nations in September. And they're going to be having a major gathering in Paris in December to try to impose mandates on the United States and China and India and the other major polluting countries, to impose mandates on them to stop the global climate change. And he goes on at length about what's being said here, but that he points out that, look, one of the things that people need to do, he said, is they need to direct their attention to a major publication that's already been done by Francis called Evangelii Gaudium, which is the joy of the Gospels and the good news in the Gospels. And what he's done in that major 50-page pronouncement,
he has said, and this is Pope Francis speaking, this is indicating what he's going to be doing in his encyclical. He said, in our times, humanity is experiencing a turning point in history. Advances are being made in so many fields of healthcare, education, and communications, but at the same time, we have to remember that the majority of our people of our planet are barely living from day to day with dire consequences. A number of diseases are spreading. The hearts of many people are gripped by fear and desperation. And a lack of respect for others and violence is on the rise, and inequality is increasing. It says the epochal changes that have been seen, that have been set in motion, and the rapid accumulation of advances are occurring in the sciences and technology. He said, but just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets clear limits in order to safeguard the value of human life today, we also must say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. Said, what kind of a system do we have when it is not news that an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is major news when the stock market loses a single point? This is a case of exclusion. Can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the most powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, and with no means of escape. Human beings are now considered mere consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a new throwaway culture, which is now spreading. It is no longer simply about exploitation and oppression by the few against the many. It is now they are being excluded to no longer be considered part of society itself. He says, and he goes on to point out that the care we need to take for the poor is directly linked to the care we need to take for our planet, because the same exact forces are at work that are increasing the rich and powerful. He points out directly in here that in the last 20 years, the richest 1% of people in the world have doubled their wealth, while the other people are becoming more and more impoverished. And he points out that, he says, one cause of this situation is found in our relationship with money, since we commonly accept its dominion over ourselves and our societies. The current financial crisis can make us overlook the fact that it originated in a profound human crisis, the denial of the primacy of the human being. We have created a new idol, the worship of the ancient golden calf of money. Said, and has returned now, and with under the ruthless guise of money and the dictatorship of an economy that is truly lacking in any human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and the economy lays bare their imbalances, and above all, their lack of any real concern for human beings. Therefore, our human family is reduced to just one of needs alone, in the need to consume. So while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by the very happy few. This imbalance is the result of an ideology which defends the absolute autonomy of the marketplace in financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of adequate control over them. Thus, a new tyranny has been born, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. Debts and the accumulation of interest make it difficult for countries to realize the potential of their own economic resources and keep citizens from enjoying their real purchasing power. To all this, we can add widespread corruption and self-serving tax evasion, which has taken on a worldwide dimension. The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits. In this economic system, which tends to devour everything which stands in its way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, and the defenseless before the interests of the rich and powerful, have now come to rule. People, therefore, have a growing suspicion about what it is he's getting ready to say. Because in his encyclical is going to be on the crisis of global climate change and transnational corporate capitalism. And he is going to call for the creation of an entirely new financial system on the planet that is going to do away with international corporate capitalism as a means of redressing the crisis that is now confronting us, and that these mindless, soulless corporations are foisting upon us as we all sit here and figure out whether it's going to be 36 inches or 46 inches of global sea change that we're going to be having. That he's getting ready to issue this statement in June, and so I've come here today to suggest to you that you familiarize yourself with the writings of Francis, and understand that he is now going to be sending out this encyclical to 5,000 bishops around the world and to 400,000 priests throughout the world, and to have them put into the pews all across the world for 1.2 billion people. This edict that we are to do away with the system of transnational corporate capitalism and to substitute for it a social justice system. So that's what I came here to talk with you about. I thought this was a good location to do it. Okay? Thank you. That's all. They're going to throw us out of here. But, thank you.